Historical figure Rudolf Höss was born in Baden-Baden, Western Germany, on November 25, 1900, as Rudolf Franz Ferdinand Höss. His father, Franz Xavier Höss, was a former officer in the German East Africa colony, which was roughly located in the present-day vicinity of Tanzania. After returning to Germany, he obtained a senior clerical position at a merchant's house that specialized in coffee and tea imports. One who reared Rudolf, the only son of 4 children. In accordance with strict Catholic and military tenets, he was a strict and austere individual. Speck was the maiden name of Pauline Höss, who was the mother of Rudolf. She reared Rudolf and his 3 sisters as a homemaker. The prosperous Höss household, which resided in Baden-Baden from the time Rudolf was 6 years old until his father achieved success in his career, was due to this. Subsequent to his life, Höss would compose melancholy works recalling an idealized youth spent with his steed as his closest companion. It bore many similarities to a prototypical German upper-middle-class family during the early 20th century, with a particular emphasis on its devout religious inclination. Rudolf's education commenced under the tutelage of a private individual when the Höss family relocated to the adjacent municipality of Mannheim when he was 6 or 7 years old. This persisted for a period of 2 years prior to his enrollment in a nearby elementary school, where he demonstrated his academic prowess, albeit not exceptional qualities. In accordance with the family's strong adherence to Catholicism, Rudolf's father desired for his son to pursue a vocation as a priest. Following Rudolf's elementary school graduation, he matriculated in a humanities institution with the potential intention of eventually enrolling in a seminary. Nonetheless, Rudolf's father's desire for him to pursue this trajectory was dashed in the early 1910s with his passing. After being liberated from the influence that was propelling him towards the priesthood, Rudolf started to be drawn to a military career. However, this was not an uncommon endeavor in Germany during the early 20th century, a nation rife with nationalist sentiment. During Höss's childhood and adolescence, Europe was in a state of turmoil, marked by an array of increasing tensions and resentments among the great powers. This centered primarily on Germany. In 1871, when the country unified into the Second German Reich, the equilibrium of power throughout Europe was profoundly upended. Germany posed a significant challenge to Britain, which had historically held the preeminent position in Europe. As a consequence, the major powers formed a succession of military alliances in the decades that followed, including Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Italy, and one consisting of Britain, France, and Russia. Early in the 20th century, these powers would engage in incessant conflict over colonial possessions and other issues. Furthermore, in addition to this armed dichotomy on the continent, there were numerous other challenges that required attention. Notable among these were nationalist tensions in areas like the Balkans, where the Ottoman Turkish Empire was in disarray and both Austria-Hungary and Russia sought to exploit the void left by the political and military collapse of Istanbul. Ancestral tribes in the Balkans, including the Serbs, held contrasting views on the matter. The ambition of these ethnic groups to eventually establish their own states would ultimately precipitate a state of war in Europe. Even though he was still in his early teenage years, the consequences of a significant conflict that broke out in Europe would be profound for Höss. The conflict, which appeared largely predetermined at the time and in retrospect, ultimately erupted during the summer of 1914. The source was the pressure cooker that constituted the Balkans. During a diplomatic visit to the city of Sarajevo in late June, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austria-Hungarian Empire, was murdered by Serb nationalist Gavrilo Princip. Following this, the Austrian government in Vienna endeavored to capitalize on the situation in the weeks that followed, with the intention of subduing the emerging Serbian state along its southeastern frontier and containing the broader nationalist movement that was gaining momentum in the Balkans. Russia retaliated by deploying troops to the area, and the situation progressively worsened until late July 1914, when Germany, Britain, and France all initiated a trade of threats. In defense of its Austrian ally, Germany declared war on Russia on August 1. 2 days later, On August 3, Berlin initiated hostilities on the French front by issuing a declaration of war. The invasion of neutral Belgium by Germany the following day prompted the United Kingdom to declare war on Germany. As a result, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand escalated significantly in the weeks leading up to the commencement of the First World War. Notwithstanding her youth of 13 years at the onset of the conflict, Höss quickly became entangled. Following in his father's footsteps, he abandoned intentions to enter the priesthood in 1915, the year after he turned 14. Consequently, he enlisted in the German army and, in spite of his advanced age, was granted enlistment in the 21st Reserve Squadron of the 2nd Baden Dragoon Regiment, an organization in which his grandfather and father had both previously been assigned. His unit was merged into the Asia Corps of the German Army following a 4-week initial training period. Its mission was to provide support to the 6th Army of the Ottoman Turks, a major ally of Germany, in the Middle East. Subsequently, he participated in multiple campaigns in the vicinity of present-day Iraq and Palestine from 1916 to 1918. It has been speculated that he might have been present during some of the atrocities committed by the Ottoman Turks, which amounted to the genocide of 1.5 million Armenians throughout the Turkish War. Additionally, he sustained 3 wounds during his service and was awarded the Iron Crescent, which is a commendation from the Turkish government, in addition to the Iron Cross Second Class. Finally, in the spring of 1918, he was even placed in command of his own cavalry unit, despite still being only 17 years of age. The conclusion of the First World War occurred in November 1918. The affair had been tortuous at best. Although the British and their allies had established a favorable position during the Middle East campaign, the primary site of conflict was northern France, where the Germans had engaged in a 4-year struggle with the French and the British over a negligible area of territory. Upon the United States' entry into the war in 1917, Western allies received a substantial influx of personnel and resources. This transpired at a critical juncture in Germany's war effort, when its capacity to sustain operations was waning. Moreover, notwithstanding its triumphant over Russia in 1917, during which the revolutionary regime of that nation had consented to cede extensive territories in Eastern Europe in exchange for the option to withdraw from the conflict. However, due to domestic opposition in Germany and the recognition that the war was unwinnable, a comprehensive military campaign against Germany in 1918 was unnecessary. The country voluntarily capitulated, effectively terminating the conflict and granting triumph to Britain, France, and their allies, while Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Turks suffered total defeat. As soon as word of the armistice spread throughout the Middle East, Höss, who was stationed in Damascus, fled in secret back to Germany so as to prevent his designation as a German officer from being interned in a camp. The return of Höss to Germany was anything but idyllic. His mother passed away while he was away in the Middle East, and he quickly encountered discord with the surviving members of his family. They desired him to resume his preparations for the priesthood, which his parents had intended for him to pursue prior to the interruption of events caused by the war. Conversely, Höss developed into a dejected individual, dissatisfied with the abhorrent peace terms imposed on Germany by Britain and France in the Treaty of Versailles, which officially terminated the war. Furthermore, he was not the only one who was let down. Tens of thousands of former German officers and soldiers formed quasi-military organizations in the immediate aftermath of the war, including the East Prussian Free Corps and the Steel Helmet League of Frontline Soldiers. These organizations functioned as both social societies catering to army veterans and borderline paramilitary organizations, with certain members genuinely endangering the peace and stability of the Weimar Republic, which had been instituted to administer Germany following the war. Höss expeditiously enlisted in the East Prussian Free Corps, also known as Freikorps, an organization that collaborated with the German government in the early 1920s to quell labor disputes and other forms of unrest. His affiliation with peripheral paramilitary organizations in interwar Germany commenced at that moment. Throughout the early 1920s, The Freikorps engaged in a number of contentious endeavors that reflected Höss's progressively extremist and violent political tendencies. For example, he was a member of a group that cued disturbance in East Prussia in 1920. A few months later, his brigade of Freikorps resolutely quelled an industrial workers' strike in the Ruhr region of Western Germany. Therefore, it is unsurprising that upon the German government's dissolution of the Freikorps in 1922, Höss shifted his allegiance to an alternative right-wing movement. This was the Nazi Party, or National Socialist German Workers' Party, an organization founded in Munich in 1920 that was progressively falling under the leadership of Adolf Hitler, an Austrian firebrand, by 1922. Furthermore, after attending a speech by Hitler in the Bavarian capital, Höss made the decision to affix his membership to the party, attaining the rank of 3,240. A quarter-century later, Höss became affiliated with a political party whose ideology would profoundly influence her life. And that ideology was founded upon authoritarianism, xenophobia, and retaliation against the Jews of Europe and Germany in general, but most importantly, a vehement anti-Semitic sentiment directed at the Jews of Germany. Rapidly thereafter, Höss became significantly embroiled with the Nazi Party. In January 1923, portions of the highly industrialized Upper Rhine region in western Germany were occupied by French and Belgian troops in retaliation for the Weimar government's failure to pay some of its war reparations. Höss affiliated herself with a collective that orchestrated acts of subversion and aggression against the occupiers. Furthermore, he and two additional former Freikorps members executed Walter Kadow, a local schoolteacher who had served as an informant for the French, in this capacity. The event transpired on the estate of Martin Bormann, who subsequently became Hitler's personal secretary and a prominent figure in the government. Subsequently, both Höss and Bormann were apprehended in connection with the crime, and Höss received a 10-year prison sentence in March 1923 for his contribution to the assassination of Kadow. Consequently, Höss was rendered incapable of participating in the putsch, an endeavor at a military uprising initiated by the Nazi Party in Munich in November 1923. It was an abject failure, and Hitler, too, was subsequently imprisoned for a number of years. Nevertheless, Höss was released from prison after serving only half of his 10-year term, and Hitler was released after serving less than a year of his sentence, actions of leniency that Europe as a whole would come to regret. Höss was released from prison in the late 1920s, having served 5 years, at a time when the situation in Germany was changing. In the autumn of 1929, following a decade of economic expansion in Europe and North America and a flourishing period that earned these decades the moniker Roaring Twenties, there was an abrupt financial collapse. The Wall Street crash and the subsequent Great Depression, which lasted for decades, had significant ramifications for Germany. In addition, as average citizens lost their employment and life savings, they voted for extremist parties at the local and national levels. Subsequently, the Nazis, which had previously existed as a marginalized faction comprised of disillusioned extremists and exiles, experienced an abrupt surge in support and grew to become the preeminent political party in Germany during the early 1930s. In the interim, Höss opted to disengage from politics after his parole, albeit maintaining connections with the Nazis. His primary objective in the immediate aftermath of his release was to commence a family. As a result, he wed Hedwig Hensel in the late summer of 1929. They had met through the Arteman League, a German rural, agrarian, and traditionalist organization in which he had become active after his release from incarceration. In the end, they produced 5 offspring, consisting of 2 males and 3 daughters. Höss maintained a subdued profile for the following decade and a half. Hitler and his Nazi Party, however, unequivocally did not. They ascended to the position of the most popular political party in Germany in 1932, receiving nearly 40% of the vote in a single election. However, their aspiration to attain a majority remained elusive and unattainable if not for a Faustian pact formed between Hitler and the leaders of Germany's foremost industrial corporations. In early 1933, industrialists such as Gustav Krupp cast their support behind Hitler on the pretext that they could exert control over Hitler and the Nazis and use them to prevent the Communists from gaining power in Germany. Within weeks, the Nazis effectively transformed Germany into a one-party dictatorship by dismantling the Weimar Republic, outlawing the Communists and other opposition organizations, and dismantling the Weimar Republic. In light of this, Höss decided to re-engage in the political sphere. He joined the Schutzstaffel or SS, one of the principal paramilitary branches of the Nazi Party, in September 1933 and became an immediate ally of Heinrich Himmler, the organization's leader. Notably, in July 1934, authority and supervision were transferred to the SS regarding the concentration centers, an undertaking initiated by the Nazis in Germany immediately following their rise to power. During this nascent period, these were comparatively modest improvised correctional facilities, occupied by political adversaries of the emerging Nazi administrations, including communists and other left-leaning organizations. Höss was temporarily assigned to the 10th Battalion of the 9th Regiment of the SS in June 1934. However, his assignment was short-lived, as he was reassigned to Dachau, a recently constructed concentration camp in Bavaria near Munich, in December of the same year. He was subordinate to Camp Inspector Theodor Eicke for the subsequent weeks at this location. Eicke was responsible for the development of the camp discipline system, which was subsequently implemented in concentration centers across Europe. Throughout his nearly 4 years in this location, Höss maintained a relatively low profile. Nevertheless, his tenure and prior experience there were adequate to secure him a transfer to one of the larger concentration centers in the late 1930s, when the Nazis initiated the consolidation of smaller camps into larger ones. This one was known as Sachsenhausen and was located just north of Berlin. Upon his arrival on August 1, 1938, Höss was initially assigned to an administrative position. However, his career progressed rapidly, culminating in his appointment as Commandant Deputy for Prisoner Affairs, which is among the highest-ranking positions in the camp administration. Concurrently, he obtained an expeditious ascent to the rank of captain in the SS during the winter of 1938. During Höss's time at Sachsenhausen, the Nazi regime he was a part of was precipitating conflict in Europe. Upon assuming power in 1933, Hitler and the Nazis initiated the process of dismantling the provisions outlined in the Treaty of Versailles. A condition of the treaty was that Germany would limit the scale of its military forces. This provision was swiftly breached by the Nazis, who immediately initiated the reconstruction of the German armed forces and air force. Then, in March 1936, Hitler violated a second significant point by deploying German troops into the Rhineland, the industrialized western portion of Germany that, according to the Treaty of Versailles, was to remain demilitarized. 2 years later, when this went largely unopposed, Berlin initiated the so-called Anschluss, an attempt to annex Austria into a larger Germany. Then, by the end of the year, Hitler exerted additional pressure on Britain to grant permission for the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia to be incorporated into Germany. The continuous appeasement provided to the Nazis by Britain and France had by this point persuaded them that little could be done to halt their advance. They were granted permission to establish Czechoslovakia and Hungary as vassal states in the spring of 1939. However, a few months later, their streak of successful conquests came to an end. The two Western powers declared war on September 3, 1939, in response to the invasion of Poland by Germany on September 1. With this, the Second World War began. Höss formally enrolled in the Waffen-SS, the military division of the paramilitary organization known for its extreme extremism, in the immediate run-up to the war. Subsequent to the conquest of the country, he was dispatched eastward into Poland. It was with this nation that he would establish his most intimate affiliation for the duration of his life. Prior to the German Reich's expansion into regions such as Poland and Austria in 1938 and 1939, Concentration camps were immediately established in those countries to house political prisoners and members of groups that the Nazi state abhorred categorically, including Jews, Gypsies, and Jehovah's Witnesses. Ashkenazic Jews were especially prevalent in Poland and other Eastern European countries during the late Middle Ages, when the majority of Western European kingdoms, including France and England, had forcibly expelled the Jewish communities. In the process, a considerable number of Jews from Europe migrated eastward, settling in countries including Ukraine, Poland, and the Baltic Sea region. As a result, upon the Nazi state's conquest of Poland in 1939, it encountered an increasing number of Jews in Eastern Europe and determined that additional concentration centers were required to detain them in Poland. The host would assume a pivotal role in these operations. Höss was designated interim director of the Sachsenhausen concentration camp towards the end of 1939. However, he would shortly be transferred from this position. In February 1940, surveyors and SS members in Poland initiated an investigation into the location of a former Polish army garrison, which was situated approximately 50 kilometers to the south of Krakow. The vicinity of the establishment comprised structures and former compounds that, despite their remote rural location, had the potential to be transformed into a significant concentration camp. Furthermore, its geographical location was optimal, as it was situated in close proximity to Germany and at a juncture of multiple major train transit routes pointing eastward. Adjacent to the fortifications was a Polish village known as Oświęcim, but it is currently recognized globally by its German name. The designation was Auschwitz. Then, in April 1940, Höss was dispatched there on Himmler's advice to conduct an inspection of the location and provide him with a report on the viability of constructing a concentration camp there. Following a visit by the Höss and his approval of the site, Himmler issued the directive on April 27, 1940, to construct Camp 1, also referred to as Auschwitz I, at Auschwitz. The initial capacity of this facility was 10,000 prisoners. A few days later, on May 1, Rudolf Höss was designated as the commandant of the newly established camping area. Although Auschwitz would grow to become the most monstrous concentration camp in Nazi Europe within the following 3.5 years, the majority of that development occurred in 1942 and later. In 1940, Höss initiated the construction of Auschwitz, a concentration camp of moderate scale, drawing inspiration from his previous work experiences at Dachau and Sachsenhausen. In an effort to self-sufficiency, Höss supervised the conversion of the former army barracks and established an agricultural farm for the camp. Consistent with the circumstances prevalent in numerous concentration camps emerging across Eastern Europe, infrastructure was also constructed to house factories operating under the auspices of the SS at Auschwitz. These factories would utilize the enslaved labor of camp inmates to manufacture war materials. Upon Hitler's visit at the onset of March 1941, the primary camp at Auschwitz had been constructed in a manner that greatly impressed him. Consequently, he issued the directive to Höss to enlarge the camp's capacity to 30,000 inmates, anticipating that the concentration camp system would face mounting scrutiny following Germany's incursion into Russia during the late summer and autumn of 1941. Worse still, Himmler, encouraging Höss to accept the challenge, directed the establishment of an adjacent camp designed to house an additional 100,000 prisoners of war. The designation for Auschwitz-Birkenau evolved from Camp 2 or Auschwitz II. Without the events of late 1941 and early 1942, Auschwitz might have remained a typical concentration camp, one of many established by the Nazis across Europe to house political dissidents and prisoners of war in deplorable conditions. In the summer of 1941, after achieving victory over the majority of Western Europe, Hitler shifted his focus to the Soviet Union in the east. In June 1941, a massive invasion of Russia was initiated. At the outset, the initiative garnered remarkable acclaim, prompting the Russian dictator, Joseph Stalin, to contemplate the possibility of entreating Germany in peace negotiations involving the transfer of vast territories to the Nazi regime. During this period, Hitler and the Nazi hierarchy started to contemplate extreme measures as a means to address the Jewish question, which they referred to as brutal ideas. The Nazis attempted for years, through persecution and coercion, to compel the Jewish population of Germany and, later, occupied territories to immigrate to the British-mandated territory in Palestine, the United States, or Britain. Furthermore, an eccentric scheme arose to expel the Jewish population of Europe to the island of Madagascar in East Africa. During the winter months of 1941 and 1942, however, everything underwent significant transformations that rendered Höss and the camp he oversaw at Auschwitz entirely unlike the concentration camp that had been founded in 1940. The Jewish question was the subject of deliberations at a conference convened in Wannsee, an area situated outside of Berlin, in January 1942. Among the attendees were several high-ranking officials from the Third Reich. At that time, the Nazis had begun to consider genuinely horrifying policy proposals. An example of this could be the notion that around 30 million Eastern Europeans would perish from starvation in an effort to provide Lebensraum, or living space, for German settlers. And as the Wannsee Conference deliberated the situation concerning the Jews in Europe, a resolution was reached to resort to acts of mass murder and genocide. The Jews of Europe would be gassed to death in the numerous concentration centers that had been established throughout Central and Eastern Europe, after being effectively detained and transported there. The objective of this euphemistically referred to final solution was the complete extermination of the Jewish population throughout the Third Reich. Auschwitz, and specifically Auschwitz-Birkenau, by virtue of its expansive facilities, its remote location from major cities and towns, and its proximity to the principal railway and road networks of Eastern Europe, came to symbolize the epicenter of the forthcoming genocidal policy. Rudolf Höss, above all else, would assume the role of overseer of the Holocaust. It is important to acknowledge that the Wannsee Conference merely served as the platform for the rubber stamping of the final solution, and the dissemination of the decision-making process to the highest levels of the Nazi regime. Yet, months prior, Hitler and other high-ranking officials, including Joseph Goebbels and Himmler, had reached the conclusion to initiate a genocidal policy. Furthermore, it seems that Höss was among the initial individuals to become aware of this development. He later asserted that he was instructed in the summer of 1941 to initiate the process of converting the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp, the second camp under construction at Auschwitz, into an extermination camp or death camp, as opposed to a prisoner-holding facility. A significant experiment that had wide-ranging implications was also carried out at Auschwitz on September 3, 1941. That day, more than 800 POWs, the majority of whom were Soviet detainees, were gassed to death in the cellars of Block 11 using prussic or hydrocyanic acid. It is more widely recognized by its commercial designation, Zyklon B. As a result, prior to the Wannsee Conference, Höss was already preparing Auschwitz-Birkenau to function as an extermination camp by early autumn 1941. Trials of the gas that would subsequently kill millions of European Jews had already taken place at this location. Shortly after the Wannsee Conference, trains transporting the initial Jews to the camps of the Holocaust began to arrive at Auschwitz. Zyklon B was typically used to execute newly arrived detainees within hours of their arrival in a charnel house that was specifically designed and situated adjacent to a crematorium within the camp. Prior to their execution, captives had their meager possessions confiscated. Those who were considered physically capable of endurance labor in the camps were the only ones who managed to survive for an extended period of time. As time passed, the influx of captives became so substantial that Höss was compelled to convert multiple additional structures into gas chambers. The incapacity to expeditiously dispose of the remains of those who had been murdered, however, was the primary cause of delays at Auschwitz-Birkenau in the months that followed. As a reaction, Höss issued an order for the fabrication of 4 sizable structures, each comprising an affixed crematorium and a gas chamber of unique design. During the interim, during the late summer and early autumn of 1942, while these units were being constructed, a significant number of the deceased were simply stacked and burned on open-air pyres. The magnitude of the murder apparatus and the number of prisoners who passed through the camps at Auschwitz prompted some to query whether the facility could have operated on such a massive scale. That being said, this is beyond any reasonable doubt. When considering its overall magnitude, the concentration camp was enormous. Upon reaching its maximum capacity, Auschwitz was comprised of 3 camps: Auschwitz I, the primary camp; Auschwitz-Birkenau, the secondary camp where the majority of the atrocities occurred; and Auschwitz-Monowitz, a minor outpost that was established to facilitate labor for the manufacture of synthetic rubber for the German war machine. Höss presided over these 3 camps, which comprised Auschwitz, and which occupied an area of approximately 8,000 hectares or 20,000 acres. Additionally, to ensure confidentiality, every civilian in the vicinity was removed, and a cordon sanitaire, or vacant zone, was established around the perimeter. Furthermore, the Nazis endeavored to persuade the populace residing in the adjacent Polish countryside that circumstances were not as they initially appeared. For example, prior to their release from the labor camp of Auschwitz-Monowitz, incarcerated individuals were required to shave and were coerced into singing in public. For those members of the minority who were not executed within hours of their arrival, camp life was dreadful. Certain individuals were spared due to their good health and potential to contribute significantly to the labor colonies. On certain occasions, entire families managed to evade direct transportation to the gas chambers in order to assemble in the family camp, an isolated facility that was operational from September 1943 to July 1944. Its purpose was to serve as a propaganda camp, concealing the true nature of the events transpiring at Auschwitz from the outside world. Otto Dove Kulka, one of the few individuals to have survived the liquidation of the family camp in the summer of 1944, has written in recent years about the camp in his memoir Landscapes of the Metropolis of Death. In it, Kulka provides a distressing narrative of his childhood experiences at Auschwitz. In addition, the existence of those who managed to survive at Auschwitz for weeks or months could be characterized as a dehumanization process. Depending on their race or alleged offense, inmates were required to wear color-coded uniforms and had serial numbers tattooed on their left arms. For instance, Jewish inmates adorned a Star of David into green and white patterned garments. Witnesses of Jehovah wore purple. 1/5 of the homosexual population, which the Nazis forced into the camps, was attired in pink, while the Roma, vagrants, and prostitutes donned black. Primo Levi's memoirs, which detail his ordeal at Auschwitz-Monowitz from February 1944 until the camp's liberation almost a year later, provide arguably the most illuminating perspectives on life within the concentration camp. Levi describes in his first account of his time at Auschwitz, "If this is a man, how the majority of detainees perished within 3 months of exposure to exhaustion and malnutrition, including those who were spared the gas chamber." In Levi's account, virtually everything is drained away, leaving only basic survival. The inmates of Auschwitz were roused at 4:30 a.m. If they failed to ascend quickly, they would have been defeated. The state of sanitation was deplorable, and access to potable water, let alone tubal water, was non-existent. Rarely did meals comprise of more than tea and coffee for breakfast. This marked the beginning of an 11-hour workday, although the duration occasionally extended during the summer months. Lunch frequently comprised a mere quantity of watery soup, whereas the evening meal comprised expired bread accompanied by meat and cheese. This latter allocation was subject to rationing so that inmates could procure food for breakfast. Sunday was designated as the weekly bathing day and day off. Although some prisoners were permitted to receive correspondence, the Jewish inhabitants of what Dove Kulka termed the Auschwitz Hades were not even granted this menial dignity. Simply over 6,000 individuals, almost exclusively males, comprised the camp staff, the majority of whom were under the authority of the SS. It is an unexpectedly modest quantity in light of the magnitude of the mass homicide that occurred at Auschwitz. An element of paradox existed in the way of life there. As an illustration, in Camp 1, Höss, his spouse, and their young children resided in a two-story villa in close proximity to the Commandant's office and the administration building. This underscores the notion that despite the atrocities that could be observed in specific sections of the camps, a sense of apparent normalcy prevailed in other regions. Moreover, this permeated lower levels of the hierarchy. The personnel of Auschwitz I, the primary camp, had access to a cinema and a theater. Former guardians have characterized it as a small town that featured a sports club and occasionally hosted dances. Additional administrators and guards recount how their initial disgust at the events transpiring at Auschwitz-Birkenau quickly transformed into apathy and the perception that they were mere cogs in a machine. Some guards even observed that the SS stationed there had developed a culture of excessive alcohol consumption. The Nazi state's uppermost leadership was fully cognizant of the events transpiring in Western Poland. It is reasonably certain that Höss received instructions to operate the camp in the way he did as early as the summer of 1941, and that these instructions originated from Hitler and Himmler in his capacity as chief of the SS. Numerous public attestations exist regarding the events that transpired at Auschwitz. Undoubtedly, among the most renowned are the renowned Posen speeches, which were delivered by Himmler in the town hall of Posen or Poznan, Poland, on October 4 and 6, 1943. Himmler had been on a tour of Central and Eastern Europe throughout 1943, delivering speeches to regional SS organizations in an attempt to boost morale that had been significantly diminished due to the German war effort's grievous setbacks. A portion of these orations were transcribed after being recorded. Himmler asserts unequivocally in the Posen speeches that the Nazi regime is presently engaged in a heinous mass murder of European Jews in concentration camps like Auschwitz. Furthermore, even less anti-Semitic and ideological members of the Nazi regime were cognizant of this. For instance, Albert Speer, the architect and Minister of Armaments, was informed of Himmler's remarks in Posen through recently uncovered correspondence. The severity of life at Auschwitz and the fact that the events transpiring at the death camp of Auschwitz-Birkenau were a poorly concealed secret in Nazi Germany are indisputable. The consequences of it are among the gravest offenses ever perpetrated by an individual. Approximately 1.3 million individuals were deported to Auschwitz during the period spanning from 1940 to 1944. An estimated 1 million of these individuals perished, with a significant portion succumbing to their wounds within hours of their arrival at the camp. Furthermore, out of the 1.1 million individuals who lost their lives in the vast extermination camp, Jews comprised the overwhelming majority, numbering 960,000. Political dissenters of some kind among ethnic Poles constituted the second largest group of victims, accounting for approximately 75,000 deaths. The remaining casualties were a mixture of Roma, Gypsy, and political prisoner populations from throughout Nazi-occupied Europe. Not only were the fatalities that transpired in this location abhorrent, but so was the icy, clinical manner in which mass murder was executed. Individuals were transported to Auschwitz, subjected to processing and gassing to death, and subsequently had their remains disposed of, all occurring within a short span of time, as if it were a streamlined administrative operation. And additional individuals were subjected to experiments conducted by the insane Dr. Joseph Mengele, while the camp soldiers perpetrated trivial acts of sadism upon the few inmates who managed to survive for several hours. Throughout the entire ordeal, Höss upheld a clinical level of efficiency. Testimonies from individuals who had survived the camps and persisted beyond the war to criticize Höss stated that he consistently exhibited an impassive, stony countenance whenever he was observed. Höss allegedly stated, in response to a question regarding the gassing procedure and the use of Zyklon B, that they could determine when the inmates of the gas chamber had died within a maximum of 15 minutes, based on the fact that they ceased to be alive when they ceased to shriek. However, despite his clinical and icy efficacy, Höss was momentarily relieved of his duties as Commandant of Auschwitz. This occurred inexplicably as a result of two events. Firstly, an investigation into financial malfeasance among senior SS officers at Auschwitz, and secondly, an extramarital affair he had with Eleanor Hoddes, a political prisoner from the camp. While Höss did not personally find himself implicated, the concomitant scandals necessitated a temporary replacement. As a consequence, he was not present at Auschwitz from November 1943 to May 1944, during which time he held the position of Chief of Department Die at the SS Economic Administrative Central Office. By virtue of this role, Höss was effectively elevated to one of the most senior positions of supervision pertaining to the entire network of concentration camps across Europe. In theory, Höss's appointment as Chief of Department Die constituted a promotion. However, he quickly initiated preparations to return to Auschwitz, where he oversaw arguably the most unsettling period in the annals of the camp. In March 1944, Hitler issued the order for the invasion of Hungary in retaliation to the Hungarian government's attempts to negotiate their surrender with the Allies. Subsequently, Adolf Eichmann, a key organizer of the final solution, was dispatched to the area with the responsibility of supervising the extermination of the estimated 750,000 Jewish inhabitants of Hungary. Consequently, Höss made preparations to reinstate himself as camp commandant at Auschwitz in order to supervise the atrocities. Then, the Nazis murdered 400,000 Hungarian Jews over the course of 6 months in 1944, from late spring to autumn. The majority of these Jews were deported to Auschwitz, where 3,000 Jews arrived daily by train during the summer months. The operation heavily relied on Höss, which was even designated with the designation Action Höss. During this period, 80% of those who arrived at Auschwitz were executed on the day of their arrival. As the Russians approached Auschwitz in the autumn of 1944, Höss was personally transferred to the Ravensbrück concentration camp, situated in close proximity to Berlin, as this process neared its culmination. The global community was not going to be oblivious to the atrocities taking place at Auschwitz or the central role that Höss played in them for much longer. Despite the escalating magnitude of the atrocities occurring at the camp, the trajectory of the war was drastically altering in opposition to Nazi Germany. The initial 3 years of the conflict had been marked by a string of victories for Hitler and his allies. However, this all changed in 1941 when they decided to invade Russia. During that winter, the German advance encountered resistance outside of Moscow and several other Russian cities. This occurred just as the United States prepared to enter the war on the side of the Allies, following the Empire of Japan's unprovoked attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The Axis were collectively and substantially defeated in North Africa throughout 1942, which facilitated the establishment of a southern front in Sicily by the United States and Great Britain in the summer of 1943. A culmination of a catastrophic war between the Germans and the Russians transpired in the vicinity of Stalingrad during the autumn and winter of 1942. Early in 1943, when the snows abated in that location, the German Sixth Army had been vanquished and the Russians were en route to Berlin via the Western Front. It was now a matter of when, not if, they would advance into Poland and reach Auschwitz, and the Russian advance in the east accelerated with the Western Allies' opening of a new front in France in the summer of 1944. The Allies possessed knowledge regarding the atrocities committed by Höss and his subordinates in Western Poland. Throughout the camp's existence, numerous escape attempts had occurred. One of these, attempted by 2 Slovak Jews, Rudolf Höss and Alfred Wetzler, was successful on April 10, 1944. After a 2-week journey through Poland, the 2 individuals reached Slovakia, where they established communication with the Slovakian resistance movement. Furthermore, it was at that location that they were capable of delivering an exhaustive account of the events transpiring at Auschwitz, encompassing the camp's blueprints. This data was subsequently transmitted to the Western Allies. An additional suggestion put forth during this period was for the Allies to bomb Auschwitz. The decision not to do so by the United States is still a matter of controversy, as the American Military High Command determined that doing so would have required an excessive diversion of resources from the bombing campaign in Western and Southern Europe, despite the concentration camps being a viable alternative. Had the Allies conducted airstrikes against the concentration camps, the mass extermination of nearly 500,000 Hungarian Jews during a 6-month campaign following the German occupation of the country in March 1944 could have been averted or at least hindered. As of 1945, when the Allies arrived at Auschwitz, they were forewarned of what they would discover there. The final liberation of Auschwitz occurred on January 27, 1945. During the late autumn and early winter of 1944, as the Soviet armies advanced westward across Poland, Höss and the other camp commanders progressively vacated the camp. Höss, in particular, opted to establish a position in an alternative camp in close proximity to Berlin. There, death remained the prevailing belief until its cessation. On January 18, 1945, the camp administrators executed one of their final acts by leading 60,000 prisoners on a death march to Władysław-Śląski. Additionally, approximately 15,000 individuals, or a quarter of the total, perished en route. Their causes of death included malnutrition, the harsh winter climate, and execution at the hands of their captors. Subsequently, the survivors were loaded onto goods wagons and transported to additional concentration camps situated further afield from the front lines, in the western direction. Upon reaching Auschwitz on the 27th, the Soviet forces discovered a mere 7,650 captives, the vast majority of whom were afflicted with illnesses, malnutrition, or starvation. Unsurprisingly, the Soviet soldiers' response was one of astonishment. Later, Primo Levi would write that the expressions on their features conveyed guilt that such a heinous crime existed, that it had been irrevocably introduced into the world of things that exist. Those who survived were detained for several days in order to receive medical treatment. Höss had, as we have seen, relocated in the autumn of 1944 in close proximity to Berlin, well in advance of the Russians' arrival at Auschwitz. At this location, he was not only tasked with supervising the Ravensbrück concentration camp near Berlin, but also a portion of the camp system in Central Europe that remained under Nazi control. However, upon receiving the final directive from Himmler to commence the execution of the remaining prisoners in Europe's camps, Höss was devoid of the necessary resources to carry out the order. Nevertheless, it is indisputable that had he been able, he would have done so. Concurrently, the Third Reich was nearing its demise. The Russians initiated their advance into eastern Germany and encircled Berlin in the early spring of 1945, while the Western Allies stormed through the Rhineland en route to Munich and Berlin. In the end, on April 30, 1945, Hitler committed suicide in his shelter located in the Reich Chancellery, which was centrally located in the besieged city of Berlin. Germany capitulated on May 8, precisely 1 week later, in an event that became recognized as Victory in Europe, or VE Day. In Europe, the conflict had come to an end. It was still necessary to apprehend the individuals accountable for its instigation and the heinous offenses that were perpetrated throughout. During the closing days of the war, Höss engaged in a meeting with Himmler, his superior at the SS. Although they had developed a strong friendship throughout the duration of the conflict, Höss subsequently stated in his testimony that the encounter had demoralized him. Himmler suggested that all SS members assume the visage of regular Wehrmacht personnel and patiently await the commencement of the Third World War, which he anticipated would transpire shortly after the conclusion of the Second. Although Höss was enraged by the suggestion, he regarded it as a directive from his superior. As a result, he expeditiously obtained the official documentation of a Kriegsmarine member and fled into concealment on Sylt Island, which is situated near the Danish border and off the coast of northwestern Germany. Subsequently, British soldiers apprehended him at this location. However, they were unable to positively identify him. Höss, who falsely claimed to be a farmer coerced into joining the German Navy, was granted release. Following that, he succeeded in eluding capture by adopting the persona of Fritz Lang, a German horticulturist and farmer residing in the area. He was not alone, however. High and middle-ranking members of the Nazi Party and the SS adopted aliases and disguises throughout Germany in order to evade prosecution and capture by the Allies. A considerable number of these individuals managed to elude apprehension for extended periods, spanning months or even years. Notable among them were Adolf Eichmann and Joseph Mengele, infamous perpetrators of the Holocaust. By migrating to South America, these Nazi war criminals frequently evaded prosecution for an extended period of time, if not forever. However, this did not apply to Höss. Early in 1946, British personnel apprehended Hedwig, the spouse of Rudolf, along with several of their children. She was ultimately compelled to divulge details regarding the whereabouts of her spouse when the Höss's son Klaus was attacked by the soldiers. The British Field Security Police were able to apprehend Höss on March 11, 1946, in Gottrupel, close to the German-Danish frontier, 10 months after the conclusion of the war, on the basis of this information. After failing to commit suicide by ingesting a cyanide pill prior to his apprehension, he attempted to conceal his true identity. In this particular case, the individual's wedding ring, which bore his name and was still on his person, served as a betrayal. Consequentially, the British police team that arrested Höss was under the leadership of Hans Alexander, a German Jew whose family had fled persecution by the Nazis and relocated to Britain in 1936. Höss was initially incarcerated in a former army facility located in Heide, Schleswig-Holstein, the northern province, subsequent to his apprehension. He was then transported south to Minden, the principal British centre where German war criminals were interrogated. Promptly, he was compelled to appear as a witness in support of Ernst Kaltenbrunner's defence. From 1943 to 1945, Kaltenbrunner presided over the Reich Central Security Office. He succeeded Reinhard Heydrich as the leader of the Wannsee Conference, during which the final solution was formulated as the official policy of the Reich in January 1945. Kaltenbrunner was among the initial cohort of defendants presented before the war crimes tribunals, which were convened in the city of Nuremberg under the auspices of the Allies. Additionally, Höss provided testimony at that location in April 1946. He displayed complete lack of remorse for his atrocities and seemingly exaggerated the quantity of individuals who were murdered at Auschwitz while he was commandant of the camp. He provided succinct responses to the inquiries posed and did not evade the fact that Auschwitz had claimed the lives of well over 1 million individuals. Furthermore, he made no effort to shield anyone, not even Kaltenbrunner, in defense of whom he had been summoned, nor did he attempt to absolve himself of culpability. He attempted no evasion other than to claim that he had been acting in accordance with Himmler's explicit directives as the leader of the SS. The Polish government petitioned for Höss' extradition to Poland as soon as he was apprehended, so that he might be brought before the courts and be held accountable in the nation where Auschwitz was situated and where he had supervised the execution of more than 1 million individuals, a significant proportion of whom were Polish citizens. The request was approved, and on May 25, 1946, Höss was dispatched to Poland. In Poland, a Supreme National Tribunal was instituted subsequent to the Russian occupation, with the explicit objective of prosecuting high-ranking Nazi war criminals who had predominantly conducted their activities within the country from 1939 to 1945. The proceedings against Höss commenced in Warsaw on March 11, 1947, garnering significant attention from around the world. He was confronted with 2 primary accusations. Firstly, membership in a criminal organization, as the Nazi regime and the SS were presently known, and secondly, Commandant of Auschwitz. He held this position from May 1, 1940, until October 1943, and once more from early summer to late autumn 1944. The second charge encompassed additional allegations of complicity in the murder of hundreds of thousands of prisoners, the moral and psychological maltreatment of numerous individuals, and the desecration of deceased bodies. The length of the trial was approximately 3 weeks. Prominent figures knowledgeable in the Holocaust, Nazi and SS policy, and former Auschwitz prisoners and staff members were called upon to testify against Höss during the proceedings. The Commandant of Auschwitz exhibited similar conduct at the trial in Nuremberg as he had the year prior. His responses to the allegations leveled against him were succinct and emotionless, and he exhibited no contrition for his pivotal involvement in the murder of more than 1 million individuals. Occasionally, he attempted to portray himself as an individual merely carrying out orders within an officer hierarchy. However, he appeared despondent at the prospect of receiving the harshest possible sentence for his offenses. Furthermore, he established an entirely fallacious differentiation between individuals who had perished at Auschwitz due to starvation or disease and those who had been gassed and cremated there, as if the camp administrators were exempt from any responsibility for the demise of those who suffered from severe illness or starvation while in the camps. On March 29, 1947, the proceedings of the trial came to a close after a duration of less than 3 weeks. On April 2, 48 days later, Rudolf Höss received a hanging sentence. Höss dedicated his last days to the preparation of his autobiography, an undertaking he had been directed to initiate by the British subsequent to his capture in Germany. Autobiographies are commonly authored by individuals seeking to laud their personal accomplishments and are typically written with the intention of being read by readers who may feel at least a trace of admiration for the author. In contrast, this one provides an in-depth analysis of Höss's personal life as well as senior SS members with whom he had collaborated extensively over the years, most notably Himmler and Theodor Eicke, under whom he had initially worked at Sachsenhausen. Notwithstanding our personal evaluations of the individual, the autobiography retains historical value due to its comparatively precise nature. Similar to his conduct during interrogations at trial in Warsaw and Nuremberg, Höss made no attempt to obscure the truth regarding his involvement in the events that transpired at Auschwitz. Thus, his autobiography provides a first-person account of the Holocaust's execution at its epicenter, as recounted by one of its principal protagonists. Its initial publication was in Polish, subsequent translations were into German and English, and it has since been reprinted in multiple editions. Höss's period of anticipation from the date of his sentencing on April 2 to its execution was notably brief, precisely 2 weeks. Furthermore, in the days leading up to his demise, specifically on April 10, the individual who had previously been considered by his religious family as a potential cleric rejoined the Roman Catholic Church and underwent the sacrament of penance. Additionally, he requested authorization to return his wedding ring to his wife and to send a departure letter to his family. Furthermore, he underwent a psychological evaluation. However, his examiner, Gustav Gilbert, an American military psychologist, could only reach the conclusion that Höss was an individual capable of behaving normally in social situations but was virtually devoid of any capacity for empathy. Höss claimed in a message to the state prosecutor 4 days prior to the execution of his sentence that he had come to the realization that his actions were improper. Consistent sentiments permeate his final correspondence with his family. His execution occurred during the wee hours of April 16, 1947. Höss was executed, perhaps not surprisingly, within a few dozen yards of the villa where he and his family had resided for a number of years in Camp 1, in close proximity to the initial crematorium that was constructed at Auschwitz. He was pronounced deceased by the court physician at 8:10 a.m. Moreover, what became of Auschwitz, the location where the Holocaust was witnessed to have transpired? Unexpectedly, the January 1945 liberation of the camp failed to garner significant attention from international media outlets during that spring. And it was not until the Western Allies liberated concentration centers like Dachau that the camp system gained international recognition. However, as time passed, Auschwitz came to represent the entirety of the Holocaust. This was due to the camp's substantial death toll and the survival of numerous witnesses who were able to provide first-hand accounts of the events that transpired there. Specifically, the post-war memoirs of prominent figures like Primo Levi and Elie Wiesel offered first-hand narratives of events that transpired in the Polish colony from 1942 to 1944. Immediately following the conflict, a museum was established at the location, and in 1979, UNESCO inscribed the camp onto its list of World Heritage Sites. The camp's entrance gates have become one of the most recognizable symbols linked to the concentration camp system and the Holocaust that occurred there. The United Nations General Assembly established January 27 as International Holocaust Remembrance Day in 2005. The rationale for choosing this date was that it corresponded to the liberation of Auschwitz in 1945. Presently, the annual influx of visitors to the camp stands at approximately 2 million individuals. Rudolf Höss is among a group of Nazi regime members who, despite being perhaps less widely recognized than Eisenhower, Göring, Goebbels, and Himmler, were crucial to the Holocaust nonetheless. During his tenure as camp commandant at Auschwitz from January 1945 to the majority of its concentration camp existence, 1940 to 1953, he oversaw the execution of more than 1 million individuals, the majority of whom were Jews from Eastern and Central Europe. Additionally, he oversaw the executions of over 100,000 Polish political prisoners, Soviet prisoners of war, and others, including Gypsies and the Roma. Auschwitz emerged as the epicenter of the Holocaust, serving as the location where an estimated 1.1 million individuals perished in gas chambers before their remains were expeditiously incinerated in crematoria. During the summer and autumn of 1944, more than half of the 750,000 Jews of Hungary were murdered in this location in a matter of months. Comparable rates of mass murder were observed only in the eastern Polish concentration camps of Treblinka and Belzec. Approximately 800,000 and 600,000 individuals were murdered in these camps, respectively, albeit within a shorter time span than at Auschwitz. Furthermore, the atrocities committed at Auschwitz were well known throughout the Nazi regime, including regional SS officers and Hitler and Himmler. Contemporary writers, including Primo Levi and Elie Wiesel, attest vividly to its anguish. The host is an enigmatic individual. Ideologically, he was undoubtedly devoted to the Nazi regime and its anti-Semitic policies. At the tender age of 17, he enlisted in the First World War, having been raised in a military family. He was thereafter perpetually confronted with violence, beginning in the early 1920s with the Freikorps and continuing through the early days of the Nazi Party, prison, and the SS. Since his mid-1930s assignment to Dachau, he oversaw the administration of concentration camps for the remainder of his life: Sachsenhausen, Auschwitz, and Dachau. One could argue that he personifies what Hannah Arendt would later refer to as the banality of evil, an individual capable of operating a mass murder machine like Auschwitz with the appearance of efficiency. Ultimately, he appeared to have achieved this, and not due to any observable animosity towards the Jews in Europe, as Hitler did. Rather, it was due to the fact that he seldom manifested any emotion, a characteristic that was evident in his composed demeanor and responses during proceedings at Nuremberg and his personal trial in Warsaw. Possibly the most unsettling element of Höss is the notion that an individual could carry out such heinous acts of mass murder with such indifference and emotionlessness. What is your assessment of Rudolf Höss? How much overall culpability does he have for the Holocaust? And to what degree did he contribute to the deplorable conditions that developed at Auschwitz throughout the Second World War? Kindly provide your feedback in the remarks section. Until then, we appreciate your attention.